On the night of November 29, 1944, a Japanese warship slipped out of Yokosuka Naval Base under cover of darkness. She had been commissioned just 17 hours earlier. Her hull measured 872 feet from bow to stern. Her displacement exceeded 64,000 tons. She was the largest aircraft carrier ever built, and her crew of 2,400 men had been told she was unsinkable. By dawn, she was gone. The Shinano went down in 7 hours and 3 minutes. 126 miles southwest of Tokyo Bay in water she was never supposed to reach. Not one aircraft ever landed on her flight deck. Not one bomb loaded in her magazines was ever armed for combat. She had never been tested in battle, never fired a weapon in anger, never performed the single mission for which 3 years of national industrial output had been poured into her keel. She sank because a single American submarine, a vessel weighing 1,125 tons, crewed by 80 men, running on diesel engines and electric motors, put 6 torpedoes into her at close range and then dove before the destroyer escort could respond. The submarine was USS Archerfish. Her commanding officer was Commander Joseph F. Enright. He had no way of knowing what he had just killed. The attack report he filed the following morning listed the target as a large carrier. Tonnage unknown. It would take months before American naval intelligence pieced together the full picture. When they did, the record was unambiguous. No submarine in the history of naval warfare had ever sunk a warship of greater tonnage. That record has never been broken. But the real story of USS Archerfish is not the record. It is the story of what that record cost to earn, and what it revealed about the 2 navies that met in the dark off the coast of Honshu on the last night of November 1944. Every week, we tell the stories behind the vessels, the weapons, and the decisions that shaped American military power. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in the winter of 1942. By the end of 1941, the United States Navy understood one thing with absolute clarity. The battleship era was over. Pearl Harbor had demonstrated it in a single Sunday morning. But the lesson that followed, the lesson that would define the entire Pacific War, came not from battleships, but from what happened beneath the surface. Japan controlled the Western Pacific. Its supply lines ran thousands of miles, from the home islands south through the Philippines, west toward Malaya, and east toward the Marshall and Caroline Island chains. Every gallon of oil, every ton of aviation fuel, every replacement aircraft engine moving to the front traveled by sea. And the sea, in 1942, belonged to no one, absolutely. The United States Navy's answer to Japan's geographic advantage was its submarine force. And in the winter of 1941 into 1942, that force was already at war, already patrolling, and already failing in ways the Navy had not publicly acknowledged. The problem was the Mark 14 torpedo. It ran deeper than its settings indicated. Its magnetic exploder detonated prematurely or not at all. Contact exploders crumpled on direct hits rather than firing. American submarines were making attacks, pressing through defensive screens at great personal risk to their crews, achieving valid firing solutions, and watching their torpedoes fail. The Bureau of Ordnance, ASAITAS, spent nearly 2 years denying the problem existed. By the time the defects were formally acknowledged in September 1943, the submarine force had fought through 3 years of war with a weapon it could not fully trust. USS Archerfish was laid down at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine, on January 22, 1943. Portsmouth had been building submarines since 1914. The yard occupied both banks of the Piscataqua River on the Maine-New Hampshire border, and by 1943, it was operating at a pace that would have been unrecognizable a decade earlier, launching a new fleet submarine every 6 to 8 weeks. Archerfish was hull number SS-311, one of 122 Balao-class boats that would eventually be authorized under the Wartime Construction Program. The Balao-class was a direct evolution of the Gato-class that preceded it. The critical difference was hull steel. Gato-class boats used steel rated for a test depth of 300 feet. Balao-class boats used high-yield steel that pushed the rated test depth to 400 feet. And experienced skippers knew the actual crush depth was considerably deeper. That additional margin was not a specification number. In combat, it was the difference between evading a depth charge pattern and not evading it. The man who would take Archerfish into the Western Pacific on her 5th war patrol, the patrol that changed everything, was Commander Joseph Francis Enright, born in 1910 in La Crosse, Wisconsin, a Naval Academy graduate of the class of 1933. Enright had commanded USS Dussie earlier in the war, and his first command had ended under a cloud. In October 1943, patrolling north of Truk, Dace had gained sonar contact on what post-action analysis suggested was the Japanese carrier Shokaku. Enright broke off the attack, uncertain of his fire control solution, and the contact was lost. Shokaku survived that encounter. She was sunk 7 months later by USS Kavala. Enright requested relief from command of Dace. He believed he had made an error. The Navy agreed to the transfer, but did not close the file permanently. Enright spent time at the Submarine School in New London, Connecticut, studying approach techniques and attack geometry. He returned to command with something harder than confidence: a precise understanding of what had gone wrong and an equally precise determination not to repeat it. He assumed command of USS Archerfish on March 8, 1944. She was 7 months out of commission, already blooded on 3 patrols, and carrying a crew that knew their boat. The strategic picture Enright inherited when he took Archerfish into the Central Pacific had shifted dramatically from the one that had existed when the boat was laid down. By mid-1944, American forces had seized the Marianas. B-29 superfortresses were flying from Saipan and Tinian. The submarine force, now equipped with functioning torpedoes after the Mark 14's defects were corrected, had torn apart Japan's merchant marine at a rate Tokyo's planners had not anticipated and could not replace. In the 12 months ending December 1944, American submarines sank approximately 600 Japanese vessels, totaling nearly 2.7 million tons of shipping. Japan's response to this pressure was to consolidate what remained of its naval power and pull it back toward the home islands. The combined fleet was broken. Its carrier air groups, decimated at the Philippine Sea in June 1944, could no longer put trained aviators into the air in meaningful numbers. What Japan retained, in terms of capital ships, in terms of industrial production, in terms of strategic logic, was increasingly concentrated in the waters immediately surrounding Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku. It was into that contracting perimeter that USS Archerfish sailed on her 5th war patrol, departing Guam on November 1, 1944. Her assigned area was the waters southeast of Tokyo Bay. Her orders were standard: interdict Japanese naval and merchant shipping, report contacts, and survive. No one in the chain of command, not at Com Subpac in Pearl Harbor, not at the submarine squadron level, not aboard Archerfish herself, had any knowledge of what was waiting for her in that assigned area. The intelligence picture for those waters was incomplete. What it did not show was that 126 miles southwest of the entrance to Tokyo Bay, in the final days of November 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing to move the largest warship it had ever built. To understand what USS Archerfish accomplished on the night of November 29, 1944, it is necessary to understand what she was and what she was hunting. A Balao-class fleet submarine, measured 311 feet 9 inches from bow to stern. Her beam was 27 feet 3 inches. She displaced 1,126 tons on the surface, 2,115 tons submerged. She carried 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward, 4 aft, and a wartime loadout of 24 Mark 14 or Mark 18 torpedoes. Her 4 diesel engines produced 5-pound 400 shaft horsepower on the surface, driving her to a maximum speed of 20.25 knots. Submerged, running on electric motors drawing from her 252-cell battery banks, she could make 8.75 knots, but only briefly. Sustained submerged speed was closer to 2 to 3 knots, the pace needed to conserve battery charge for an extended approach or evasion. The Balau's combat advantage was not speed. It was stealth, endurance, and depth. She could remain at sea for 75 days. She could dive to a tested depth of 400 feet, and she could track a surface target on the surface at night. Running on diesels, radar mast up, her low silhouette nearly invisible against a dark horizon. At speeds that allowed her to maneuver for a favorable attack position before submerging. That tactical geometry, surface tracking, submerged attack, was the foundation of American submarine doctrine in the Pacific. It required a commanding officer who could read a contact's course and speed with precision, calculate the geometry of an intercept, position his boat ahead of the target's track, and execute a firing solution at the moment the target crossed the optimal range. It was, in its essentials, a mathematical problem solved under pressure, in darkness, with incomplete information. While destroyers swept the surrounding water with sonar and depth charges, Enright had spent a year studying exactly that problem. Now consider what was moving toward him. The Shinano had begun her life not as a carrier, but as the third hull of the Yamato-class. Japan's answer to the Washington Naval Treaty's collapse and America's growing naval construction program. Yamato and Musashi, the first 2 hulls, were the largest battleships ever built. 863 feet long, displacing 72,000 tons at full load. Armed with 9 18.1-inch guns capable of hurling a 3,200-pound shell nearly 26 miles. They were the physical expression of Japanese naval philosophy. That qualitative superiority in individual warship capability could offset American quantitative advantage in total fleet numbers. The third hull, what would become Shinano, was laid down at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal on May 4, 1940. Her keel was originally configured for the same battleship role, then Midway intervened. In June 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, in 4 days. The strategic calculus of the Pacific War shifted overnight. Carriers were now the decisive instrument. Battleships, for all their armor and firepower, could not project air power. The decision was made in the summer of 1942 to convert the incomplete third Yamato hull into a carrier. The conversion was unlike any carrier construction program that had preceded it. Shinano would not be a standard fleet carrier. She would be a support carrier, an armored mobile base designed to transfer aircraft, munitions, and fuel to frontline carrier groups operating in forward areas, while her own armor protection made her resistant to the kind of air attack that had destroyed her predecessors. Her flight deck was armored. Her underwater protection system, the void and liquid layering designed to absorb torpedo warhead energy, incorporated lessons drawn directly from the analysis of how Yamato-class armor had performed in testing. Her beam at the waterline was 119 feet. Her belt armor ran 16.1 inches at its thickest point. She carried anti-torpedo bulges, external blister structures filled in alternating layers with void space and water-resistant material. Designed to detonate a torpedo warhead outside the main hull and dissipate the explosive energy before it reached the pressure hull. On paper, she was the most torpedo-resistant surface warship the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever put to sea. She was also, in November 1944, critically unfinished. Shinano had been commissioned on November 19, 1944, not because she was ready, but because American B-29s were now reaching the Kanto Plain from the Marianas, and Yokosuka was a target. The Navy's judgment was that an incomplete Shinano was safer at Kure, 400 miles to the southwest, than in a dry dock within range of American strategic bombers. Her fitting out was barely 60% complete. Her watertight integrity systems had not been fully tested. Hundreds of workers were still aboard when she departed. Her damage control teams had received no coordinated training as a unit. The compartment ventilation systems that should have isolated flooding were not fully operational. Fittings throughout the hull had not been properly sealed. Her captain, Rear Admiral Toshio Abe, reportedly requested a delay in the departure. The request was denied. She sailed on the evening of November 28, 1944, escorted by 3 destroyers, Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze. Her course took her southwest along the coast of Honshu, running at 20 knots, zigzagging on a pattern designed to complicate any submarine fire control solution. USS Archerfish had been on station in those waters for 3 weeks. On the evening of November 28th, Enright was on the surface, running a standard patrol. At 20:48 hours, his radar operator reported a contact, large, bearing 030, range approximately 12 miles. Enright tracked it. The contact was not moving like a merchant vessel. It was large, fast, and escorted. He went to battle stations. He pushed Archerfish to full surface speed, 20 knots, and began working to get ahead of the contact's track. For the next 6 hours, he ran a surface pursuit in the darkness, calculating and recalculating the geometry of the intercept. The target was making approximately 20 knots and zigzagging. Each time Archerfish gained a favorable position, the target's zigzag leg carried it away. Each time Enright adjusted, the geometry shifted again. At 0300 hours on November 29th, after more than 6 hours of maneuvering, Shinano executed a zigzag leg that brought her directly toward Archerfish's position. The range closed rapidly. Enright ordered the boat submerged. He went to periscope depth. The target was now clearly visible. Enormous, high-sided, flanked by destroyers. At 0307 hours, Archerfish fired 6 torpedoes from her forward tubes, range at firing, approximately 1,400 yards. The spread was calculated to walk across the target's beam as she passed. 4 of the 6 torpedoes struck. The hits were confirmed by the sound of detonation, by the abrupt deceleration of the target, and by the immediate turn of the escort destroyers toward Archerfish's firing position. Enright took the boat deep. The destroyers dropped 48 depth charges over the next several hours. None found Archerfish. At 0600 hours, sonar reported the distinctive sound of a large vessel breaking up. The Shinano, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, went to the bottom at 10:57 hours on November 29, 1944. She had been at sea for 17 hours and 25 minutes. The news reached COMSUBPAC headquarters in Pearl Harbor through the Standard Patrol Report channel. Enright's after-action account was precise and restrained, the product of a commanding officer who had learned, at considerable personal cost, the difference between what he could confirm and what he could only assume. He reported 4 hits on a large carrier. He reported the sound of the vessel breaking up on sonar. He reported the course, speed, and approximate dimensions of the target. He did not claim a tonnage record. He did not know what he had killed. Naval intelligence began working the problem immediately. The contact's size, speed, and escort configuration pointed toward a capital ship. The location, southeast of Tokyo Bay, on a course toward the inland sea, was consistent with the transit from Yokosuka to Kure. Cross-referencing signal intercepts, aerial reconnaissance data, and the fragmentary picture of Japanese naval movements that had been assembled over months of collection. The analysts arrived at a conclusion that initially seemed improbable. The vessel Archerfish had sunk, was a carrier of a class that American intelligence had not previously confirmed as operational. The full identification of Shinano as the target took months. It was not publicly announced during the war. The record was confirmed after the Japanese surrender through direct examination of Imperial Japanese Navy records, survivor debriefs, and the post-war assessment conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. The Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee, JANAC, the body charged with verifying and crediting American submarine kills, formally attributed the Shinano to USS Archerfish. The confirmed displacement made it the largest vessel ever sunk by a submarine in the history of naval warfare. That finding has not been revised. Enright received the Navy Cross for the attack. The citation credited him with the destruction of a Japanese carrier of the Shinano-class. What it did not say, because the full tonnage figures were still being verified, was that Archerfish had just set a record that no submarine crew in any navy has since broken. But the Shinano was not the whole of USS Archerfish's war. She had been in combat since the fall of 1943, and her record across 6 patrols reflects the full arc of what the American submarine campaign against Japan actually looked like. Not as a sequence of decisive individual engagements, but as a sustained, grinding, strategically decisive attrition campaign conducted across millions of square miles of ocean. Her first war patrol, from October to December 1943, took her to the waters around Truk, Japan's major forward naval base in the Caroline Islands. The anchorage that American planners called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. She made contacts, conducted approaches, and fired torpedoes. Results from that patrol were limited, a pattern common to the early patrols of boats still developing their crew coordination and approach technique under wartime conditions. Her second patrol, running from January to March 1944, took her into the East China Sea, one of the most heavily trafficked and most dangerous operational areas available to American submarines. The East China Sea sat between the Chinese coast, the Korean peninsula, and the Japanese home islands. Japanese anti-submarine patrols were frequent. Water depth in portions of the area was shallow enough to complicate evasion after an attack. The merchant traffic was dense because those sea lanes carried the coal, iron ore, and foodstuffs moving between the Asian continent and Japan's industrial heartland. Archerfish operated there under conditions that demanded precise navigation and disciplined fire control. Her third patrol extended into the spring of 1944, as American forces were advancing through the Central Pacific and the strategic geography of the submarine war was shifting. The interdiction of Japanese supply lines was no longer simply a campaign objective. It was producing measurable strategic results. Japanese shipbuilding could not replace losses at the rate American submarines were generating them. The mathematics of attrition were turning decisively against Tokyo. Her fourth patrol, in the summer of 1944, coincided with the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the engagement American aviators called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, in which Japanese carrier aviation suffered losses from which it never recovered. Archerfish was not present at the Philippine Sea battle itself, but she was operating in waters where the consequences of that battle were immediately visible. Japanese naval movements became more cautious, more concentrated, more oriented toward defense of the home islands. By the time Enright took Archerfish out on her fifth patrol in November 1944, the submarine force of which she was a part had fundamentally altered the strategic position of the Japanese Empire. At peak strength in 1944, the U.S. submarine force numbered approximately 150 fleet boats operating in the Pacific. Yamato-class, Palau-class, and the newer Tench-class boats beginning to reach the fleet. They operated from forward bases at Pearl Harbor, Midway, Brisbane, Fremantle, and, after the Marianas Campaign, from Guam and Saipan. Their combined effort had reduced Japanese merchant shipping from approximately 6 million tons at the start of the war to under 2 million tons by late 1944. The human cost of that campaign was real and documented. Of the approximately 16,000 men who served in American submarines during the Pacific War, 3,505 were killed, a loss rate of roughly 22%, the highest of any branch of the American armed forces. 52 American submarines were lost to all causes. Their names are recorded at the Submarine Force Museum in Groton, Connecticut, on a memorial that lists each vessel with the notation, "Still on patrol." Archerfish was not among them. She survived. What the tonnage record obscured in the years immediately after the war was the broader operational significance of what Archerfish had done, and what the submarine force as a whole had accomplished by the time Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945. The Shinano sinking was not simply a tactical achievement. It was the punctuation mark on a strategic argument that American naval planners had been making against considerable institutional resistance since before the war began. That argument was this: in a conflict fought across the distances of the Pacific, the submarine, not the battleship, not even the carrier, was the most cost-effective instrument of strategic pressure available to the United States Navy. A fleet submarine cost approximately $5 million to construct in 1943 dollars. She could be crewed by 80 men. She could operate independently, without escort, for 75 days. And she could, on a single patrol, destroy shipping tonnage that had taken years and hundreds of millions of dollars to build. The Shinano alone had consumed 3 years of construction at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, the largest and most capable naval construction facility in Japan. Her conversion from battleship to carrier had required the diversion of steel, labor, and industrial capacity that Japan could not afford to spend in 1942 and 1943, and could not afford to lose in 1944. She went to the bottom, carrying aircraft parts, equipment, and stores intended to support frontline carrier operations, materiel that Japan had no practical means of replacing. The USSBS, United States Strategic Bombing Survey, examined the Japanese war economy in exhaustive detail after the surrender. Its findings on the submarine campaign were unambiguous. American submarines, the survey concluded, had been responsible for approximately 55% of all Japanese shipping losses during the war. The destruction of Japan's merchant marine had, by the summer of 1945, reduced imports to the home islands to roughly 10% of their 1941 levels. Oil imports had effectively ceased. Aluminum production had collapsed. Food distribution across the home islands was deteriorating toward levels that the survey's analysts described as pre-famine. The submarine campaign had not ended the war by itself, but it had created the material conditions under which Japan's ability to continue the war was becoming physically unsustainable. Archerfish's sixth and final war patrol, running from January to March 1945, took her back into the waters east of the Japanese home islands. By that point, profitable targets were scarce. Japan had withdrawn most of its remaining naval vessels into coastal waters and harbors, where shallow depths and concentrated anti-submarine defenses made submarine attack prohibitively risky. The great killing grounds of 1943 and 1944, the shipping lanes of the Central Pacific, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, were effectively empty of the kind of traffic that had once made them productive hunting grounds. The campaign had succeeded so completely that it had destroyed its own target set. Archerfish returned to Guam in March 1945. She conducted no further war patrols. Japan surrendered in August. Archerfish was in Pearl Harbor when the formal surrender ceremony took place aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. She had made 6 war patrols. She had fired torpedoes in anger on multiple occasions. She had survived 48 depth charges on the night of the Shinano attack alone. and an unknown additional number across her other patrols. She had returned every crew member who sailed with her on the 5th patrol to port alive. Her confirmed kill, Shinano, represented, by GenX figures, the largest single vessel sunk by any submarine in any navy in the history of undersea warfare. No additional major surface combatant kill was credited to Archerfish by GenX. Some wartime claims from earlier patrols were not confirmed in post-war assessment, a pattern common to the majority of the submarine force's wartime records when cross-referenced against Japanese shipping records after the surrender. What remained, when the tonnage figures were tallied and the patrol reports were filed, was a simpler and more durable fact. On a November night in 1944, a fleet submarine crewed by 80 Americans had intercepted the largest warship Japan had ever commissioned, had fired 6 torpedoes at close range, and had sent her to the bottom before she could fire a single weapon in her own defense. The record stood. It stands today, but records do not guarantee survival. And USS Archerfish, the most successful submarine hunter of capital ships in naval history by tonnage, was about to discover what peace does to instruments of war. The war ended in August 1945. Within 18 months, USS Archerfish was gone from the active fleet. Her decommissioning on April 12, 1946, was not accompanied by ceremony. No flag officers attended. No official statement marked the occasion as significant. She was placed in reserve at New London, Connecticut, one of dozens of fleet submarines that the Navy no longer had the budget, the manpower, or the strategic rationale to operate. The process was administrative. A crew was reduced. A logbook was closed. A vessel that had hunted across the Western Pacific for 2 years was tied to a pier and left. The institutional logic behind what happened to Archerfish and to the fleet submarine force as a whole in the years immediately following 1945 requires understanding what the war had done to American strategic thinking. The atomic bomb had not merely ended the war with Japan. It had rewritten the foundational assumptions of American military planning in ways that would take a decade to fully manifest. But whose direction was immediately apparent? If a single weapon could destroy a city, the entire calculus of industrial attrition, the patient grinding campaign of interdicting supply lines, destroying merchant tonnage, strangling an enemy's economy across years of sustained pressure, became strategically secondary almost overnight. The submarine's great virtue had been its ability to prosecute exactly that kind of long campaign. In a world where strategic decisions might be made in hours rather than years, that virtue was suddenly less relevant to the planners who controlled defense budgets. The Navy's submarine force shrank rapidly. Of the approximately 230 fleet submarines that had been in commission or under construction at the war's end, the majority were decommissioned, placed in mothballs, or sold for scrap within 5 years. The construction program that had produced 122 Naval-class boats, the program that had built Archerfish, was terminated. The newer Tench-class boats, which had just begun reaching the fleet in meaningful numbers in 1945, survived in larger proportions, but even they were cut dramatically from planned totals. The strategic doctrine that had guided the submarine campaign, unrestricted warfare against enemy shipping, the deliberate targeting of merchant vessels and supply lines as a primary war aim, was not formally enshrined in post-war Navy doctrine. It existed in the record. It existed in the USSBS findings. It existed in the memories of the men who had conducted it, but it did not translate cleanly into the new strategic environment, where the adversary was the Soviet Union, where the anticipated conflict was shorter and more violent than the Pacific War, and where the submarine's primary post-war mission was redefined around anti-submarine warfare, hunting Soviet submarines, rather than the commerce rating that had made the Pacific campaign decisive. The boats that survived the post-war cuts were progressively modernized. The Guppy program, greater underwater propulsion power, converted selected fleet submarines with streamlined hulls, enlarged battery banks, and snorkel systems that allowed diesel engines to run while submerged. Archerfish was not among the early Guppy conversions. She remained in reserve, her wartime configuration unchanged, her record unacknowledged in any public forum that reached beyond the community of submarine veterans and naval historians who already knew it. She was briefly reactivated. The Korean War created pressure to return mothballed assets to service, and Archerfish was recommissioned on January 19, 1952. She served as a training vessel, not a front-line combatant, but a platform for developing the next generation of submariners. The role was useful. It was not the role of a vessel whose wartime record justified the designation she carried. She was decommissioned a second time on February 1, 1955. She was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on December 1, 1969. She was sold for scrapping. The scrapping contract was executed. The hull was broken up. No portion of USS Archerfish was preserved. No museum acquired her. No memorial was constructed at the site. The submarine that held the record for the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine was rendered into scrap steel and ceased to exist as a physical object. The record remained. The boat did not. There was no congressional hearing. There was no budget fight. There was no contractor lobbying campaign or export push or last-minute reprieve from a sympathetic flag officer. What happened to Archerfish was quieter and in some ways more final than any of those endings. She was simply no longer needed. The Navy had new submarines, nuclear submarines, boats that could remain submerged for months, that carried ballistic missiles capable of reaching Moscow, that represented a strategic capability so far beyond what Archerfish had been built to do that comparison was almost meaningless. USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, was commissioned on September 30, 1954, 3 months before Archerfish was decommissioned for the second and final time. The message in that timeline required no interpretation. The age that had produced Archerfish was over. The age that had made her record possible. The age of long Pacific patrols, of diesel engines and electric motors and periscope attacks at 1,400 yards, of fleet submarines hunting carriers in the darkness off the coast of Honshu, had passed completely. What replaced it was faster, deeper, more powerful, and utterly indifferent to the records of the vessels it had superseded. The scrapping order was signed. The cutting torches were lit. The hull came apart. No ceremony, no statement, no flag. What USS Archerfish left behind was not a hull. It was not a museum exhibit or a memorial plaque at a naval base. What she left behind was a documented fact, written into the permanent record of naval warfare, that no amount of institutional reorganization or strategic reorientation has ever been able to erase. On November 29, 1944, a diesel-electric fleet submarine displaced 1,126 tons and crewed by 80 men sent a 64,000-ton warship to the bottom in 7 hours. The ratio, 42-1 in displacement in favor of the vessel that lost, remains the most extreme in the history of submarine warfare against surface combatants. The technologies Archerfish embodied did not disappear with her hull. The Yamato-class design philosophy, the emphasis on depth capability, crew endurance, and attack geometry over raw speed, informed every American submarine development program that followed. The Guppy conversions of the late 1940s and early 1950s took the Balao hull form as their baseline. The approach techniques refined by commanders like Enright, the surface tracking pursuit, the submerged firing solution calculated against a maneuvering target, were codified into submarine attack doctrine and taught at the submarine school in New London for a generation after the war ended. The unrestricted submarine warfare campaign itself, despite its absence from formal post-war doctrine, became one of the most studied case studies in the history of economic warfare. The USSB's findings on the submarine campaign's contribution to Japan's economic collapse were incorporated into the curricula of the Naval War College, the Army War College, and defense policy programs at universities across the country. The lesson that a sustained campaign against an adversary's logistical infrastructure conducted by a relatively small force of highly trained operators could produce strategic effects disproportionate to the force's size, did not require formal doctrinal endorsement to remain operationally influential. The Shinano herself left a different kind of legacy. Her wreck lies at a depth of approximately 1,000 meters in the Philippine Sea, southeast of the Key Peninsula. She has never been formally surveyed by a research expedition. Her position is known from the navigational records of her escorting destroyers and from the post-war testimony of survivors. What lies on the bottom is the largest warship wreck in the Pacific theater. Larger than Yamato, larger than Musashi, larger than any American vessel lost in the war. She remains there, undisturbed, carrying the aircraft parts and stores she was transporting when Archerfish found her. The human footnote to this story belongs to Joseph Enright himself. After the war, Enright remained in the Navy, eventually retiring at the rank of Rear Admiral. He spent the post-war decades acutely aware that the full story of what Archerfish had accomplished was not widely known outside naval circles. The Shinano's existence had been classified during the war. Her identity as Archerfish's target had not been publicly confirmed until after the Japanese surrender. For years, the record of the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine existed in official documents that most Americans had never read, and most naval historians had not yet synthesized into a coherent public account. In 1987, Enright co-authored a book with journalist James W. Ryan titled Shinano, The Sinking of Japan's Secret Supercarrier. The account drew on Archerfish's patrol reports, Enright's personal recollections, survivor testimony from Shinano's crew, and the post-war JANIC assessment. It was the first comprehensive English-language account of the engagement written for a general audience. Enright was 77 years old when it was published. He had waited more than 4 decades to tell the story in full. The book's central argument was not self-congratulatory. Enright was careful to acknowledge what the historical record actually showed, that Shinano's rapid sinking owed something to her incomplete fitting out, to her unsealed compartments, to her crew's lack of damage-controlled training as an integrated unit. He did not claim that Archerfish alone had sunk an unsinkable ship. He claimed accurately that Archerfish had found her, tracked her, fired at her, hit her, and that the combination of those hits and those deficiencies had sent her to the bottom. The record, he argued, belonged to the boat and the crew, not as a measure of their superiority over the men who died on Shinano, but as a measure of what American submarine doctrine, American industrial production, and American crew training had made possible by the autumn of 1944. The honest verdict on USS Archerfish, as rendered by naval historians, by JANIC, by the USSBS, and by the post-war assessments that have examined the Pacific submarine campaign in detail, is not complicated. She was one boat among 150 operating in the Pacific at the height of the campaign. Her individual patrol record outside the Shinano engagement was competent rather than exceptional. What made her exceptional was a single night, a single intercept, and a commanding officer who had learned from one failure precisely how not to repeat it. The record he set on that November night has stood for more than 80 years. Every Navy that has operated submarines since 1944 has conducted exercises, developed doctrine, and built vessels in the awareness that a submarine, small, quiet, patient, and precisely commanded, can find and destroy a warship of any size. Archerfish did not create that awareness. but she demonstrated it at a scale that removed any remaining doubt. If you found this history valuable, give the video a like. It is the single best signal you can send this channel. And if you want more stories about the vessels, the weapons, and the decisions that shaped American military power, subscribe to Defense Archive. We'll see you in the next one. Somewhere in the Philippine Sea, at a depth of 1,000 meters, the hull of the Shinano rests on the bottom, her armored flight deck intact, her anti-torpedo bulges still fixed to her sides, her magazine still loaded with the munitions she never delivered. She went down on a heading of southwest, 126 miles from Tokyo Bay, before a single aircraft touched her deck. She is still there. Archerfish put her there. And no submarine, in any navy, in any ocean, has ever done it again.